So I only have about 20 minutes. We're trying to save time for discussion, so I don't have too many slides, but I'll try to give an overview of these 5 tips as quickly as I can. But then for questions at the end, feel free to go beyond these 5 tips, or if there's something that I skipped over that you want to know more about, please don't hesitate to let me know. And there are definitely more than 5 tips for engaging in ethical Indigenous research, but for time's sake, we're going to focus on just 5 today. So tip 1, and this is probably the most important, and I see this a lot, you have to start research early if you're trying to engage Indigenous communities or participants. And so you can start Indigenous engagement with a limited budget. You can start with limited knowledge, but you cannot start without one key resource, which is time. And so there are many things about Indigenous research that require significant amounts of time, primarily building relationships. And I'll get into that more later. So I'll sort of leave that one for now, but building relationships obviously takes time. Cultural protocols, a lot of people don't realize that Indigenous communities might be looking for you to follow cultural protocols that are relevant to them. That might be gifting of tobacco, that might be starting with a cultural ceremony of some kind, like a pipe ceremony, things like that. That takes time to organize and get arranged. It takes time to understand the relevant frameworks and practices, which I'll get into next. And it takes a lot of time to co-develop research questions, methodologies, and methods. And I'll break this down one a little bit more in one of the next slides. But what I mean by that is that quite often Indigenous communities and participants are seeking to be involved in research from the early stages. So they want to help co-create the research questions. They want to help determine which methodologies and methods are appropriate. And that really benefits you as the researcher, because it ensures that whatever direction you're taking with those items, that they're going to be applicable to your stakeholders. So it takes time, but it is absolutely crucial and will make things much easier down the road. Of course, ethics review processes take time. And I'm fairly new to the REB, but I am not new to the process. And I know that you need to count back at least a couple of months from when you want to be in the community doing your work to when you've put in your ethics application for review. And that goes for all universities, not just the University of Regina. And then finally, a lot of people understand you have to get approvals from your institution as a researcher, but they forget that communities and organizations might also have their own approval mechanisms that they need to go through. So for a First Nations community, maybe you have touched base with the health director, the education director, but then they have to actually go and get approval from, let's say, their senior manager or their chief and council, and maybe they only have meetings every couple of weeks, or you've missed the one, it just happened yesterday. So you need to keep in mind you have 2 timelines there for approvals, your own as a researcher and that of your community partner. This seems like a bit of a silly one, but it's an important one. And quite frankly, I still see this a lot at IPHRC when we're supporting researchers. So tip number 2 is you need to figure out the who. People still use the word Indigenous and First Nations. I hear that phrase a lot, but actually Indigenous is 3 different groups. It's First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. And those are all very different populations. And within them, there's even subgroups. So you need to figure out when you're doing research, are you talking about Indigenous people in general, including all the members of those 3 groups? Or are you talking about First Nations, or are you talking about Inuit, or are you talking about Métis? Interestingly, in Saskatchewan, we use the word Indigenous a lot, but we actually have a very small Inuit population. So really, most of the research that we say we're doing that is Indigenous is actually not inclusive of the Inuit population. In Saskatchewan, most research is primarily focused on our 2 larger groups, which are First Nations and Métis. It gets even more complicated because then you have to figure out, are you talking about urban Indigenous people living in rural areas, or people living in remote areas? Because those are all three very different concerns and different organizational structures. Speaking of organizational structures, are you talking about First Nations communities or organizations? Because there are First Nations organizations that partner in research all the time. There's the Federation of Sovereign Indigenous Nations in Saskatchewan. There are, All Nations Healing Hospital in Fort Capel. There is urban Indigenous organizations that provide services like RITSIS in Regina. So you need to figure out, are you partnering with someone at the organizational level, or are you looking for an actual community like, let's say, George Gordon First Nation? Then there's tribal councils. Tribal councils provide secondary level services and are part of First Nations governance structures in Saskatchewan. So we have tribal councils that are representative of many First Nations communities. And so if you're partnering with a tribal council, keep in mind that that's not just one community. It can be like up to 10 or 12 communities that you're talking about. So be specific. Already talked about communities. When I say the word community, I'm usually meaning a First Nations reserve. And then even within First Nations people, there are those of us who hold status and are called status Indians, and there's those of us who are non-status. So you can be that specific as well. And then treaty versus non-treaty. I often hear the terms status and treaty used interchangeably. They're actually not interchangeable terms. Status has a different meaning than treaty, and there are actually First Nations people in Saskatchewan who have status, but did not sign on to treaties, just to make it more complicated for you. And then finally, there's a fluidity of these identities. So sometimes, especially with people reclaiming their culture right now, people may self-identify as Métis in one point in their life, and then as policies and legislation change, or they go through this process, they may end up with First Nation status and be exploring that element of their identity. The other part of that is intersectionality. So are we talking about First Nations men, women? Are we talking about the queer community within the Indigenous community? Who exactly are you targeting? And beyond the fluidity of that identity in terms of, I kind of gave those examples, but a lot of First Nations members move between living on reserve and in urban areas. So you have to keep in mind being specific about who you're talking to, and that each of these groups has different considerations, concerns, and statistics that go with them. Tip number 3, learn the frameworks. And this is really good to do and start prior to your engagement. It's tough to do this as you engage. You'll learn more as you go through the process. But if you want to be a little more confident going into it, then learn what the relevant frameworks are. So what are the wise practices that are relevant to your area? And they're different. I primarily do health research, so I'm more familiar with those. But if you're doing something else, then I would encourage you to find someone who's done Indigenous research in that area and has talked about what worked for them. You also really need to spend time learning about the bad research that was done on and not for, with, or by Indigenous people. So the history of research for Indigenous people globally, but in Canada as well, is that it has been exploitive, it has been violent, it has been disadvantageous to us, it has been extractive, and it has traditionally only benefited the researchers who have come in to do the research and not the communities. And these cases are, so numerous in Canada, including, medical experimentation being done on First Nations children in residential schools without their consent and without their parents' consent, and with research that goes against human rights. And there's so many examples. So you need to be aware of that, because when you're coming into Indigenous contexts, it means that's the weight that we're carrying on our back. So that's why it takes time to build trust. That's why we ask for things like research agreements. That's why we are really looking to suss out if you have good intentions or not. And the Indigenous way of saying that is quite often, are you coming to do research in a good way? And that's what we're getting at. So some of those tools and frameworks are OCAP, the Tri-Council Policy Statement 2, Chapter 9. First Nations University and IPHRC offers a couple of training seminars. One is BRIC, which is Building Research Relationships with Indigenous Communities. That's fabulous. 4 Seasons of Reconciliation. ERLIT is actually a free one you can go to on the FNUNIV website under the Indigenous, or yes, First Nations University Center for Continuing Education. That's where you can find all 3 of these. ERLIT stands for Indigenous Research Level of Engagement Tool. And it's actually a tool where you can measure as a researcher how engaged your research actually is with Indigenous communities, because sometimes it's very tokenized, sometimes it's very meaningful. So that's a free tool that you can use to actually measure that level of engagement. There's also a free workshop on that website for trauma-informed care. There are lots of resources for trauma-informed care, though, if you want to look at other places. The idea of cultural safety and understanding where that comes from, and so many more. There are so many frameworks. You can Google these things at your leisure, but it is important to learn what they are. So number 4, clear communication. And I have here, because we tend as researchers to talk a lot, and we are used to being the most important person in the room. When you are doing Indigenous engagement, you are not the most important person in the room. It's not your PhD that matters. You have to come with good intentions and an open heart and an open mind about what you are trying to do. So you need to practice talking less and listening a lot more to Indigenous community partners. You also need to be prepared to talk about so-called scary things like budget and resources. You need to be really clear and realistic with your Indigenous community partners, what you have. You know, Indigenous communities have really seriously poor outcomes in areas like health, education, etc. So we are looking for really big solutions. We do want to work on really big things, but that doesn't mean that we won't sign on to do a smaller project with you if it's something that's relevant. So don't lie, don't make promises you can't keep, just be clear and realistic about the budget and resources that you have. This one I highlighted because this happens way too often. So we always get this problem. Researchers with the best intentions will tell us, well, I don't want to, involve an Indigenous community partner until I get the money, because what if I put in the grant application and we don't get it and they're disappointed? So they go ahead and do that. And then they end up at places like IPHRC seeking support because they're like, so we got the money, but we don't have an Indigenous community partner. And now they're trying to start that process. And the clock is now ticking on their grant dollars. And I just told you need time. So you've already lost a bunch of time. The second part of this is, what if you got your research questions wrong? What if you chose the wrong methodology? What if you're missing expertise on your research team that you could have included had you signed on that community partner much sooner? So do not wait until you get the grant to approach Indigenous communities. And I promise, if we sign on as Indigenous communities and you don't get the grant, you will not break our hearts. It's not going to be the first time. We are not that fragile. We are very resilient. We have received much worse news before. It will not break our hearts. We will bounce back. But be clear with us and explain, here's the feedback we got from reviewers. Talk to us about whether we want to do a resubmit or not and what the revised timelines will be. That's where it comes back to being really clear and direct. Remember to seek approvals and permissions from the right people at the right levels. So I was just in a discussion the other day where we were talking about, is it always, necessary to go get approval from chief and council? It really depends on the community and the context. There are some situations where they have given that authority or designated that to somebody else on their behalf. Like, let's say, I'm going to use health again, their director of health has a really good relationship knows what the community and the chief and council will sign on to and what they don't. And so they have given their health director the permission to say, yeah, if you think the research benefits us, feel free to sign the agreement on our behalf and then come give us updates at chief and council. So it's really important to figure out, are you getting approvals and permission from the right people at the right levels? And if you can, have that in writing, even if it's just an email, you know, emailing that health director being like, we really loved working with you. We're about to sign the research agreement. I just want to confirm that you are the designate on behalf of your community with the authority to sign this agreement. And then they can email you back and say yes, and you've done something there. So this is a tricky one, but just be cognizant of it. And then in-person versus virtual. And so in-person does take more money for meeting and building relationships than virtual, but it is really important. You know, everybody who works at IPHRC, for example, is Indigenous. We work with community partners all the time. There are ones that place a lot of trust in us. I can tell you, we still don't do anything 100% virtual. We still expend budget on meeting in person, having a lunch together, sharing physical space, having knowledge keepers in to offer a prayer and make sure we start research in a good way. And you can't replace that with virtual. Maybe later as the grant gets going, but I really do still think in person is a really crucial element of ensuring clear communication and building trust. It also shows your investment. And make sure you're asking community partners questions, because sometimes community partners don't know what they have a right to ask. And so the more that you can draw that out and let them know that it's okay to be asking questions, or it's okay to be, you know, constructively critical or skeptical, ask them, who are we missing? Are we missing somebody? We've invited person A and B, but who else should be here? Anything else you would like me to know? Do you need more time? Because often putting people on the spot and saying, I need this now, and can I get a yes or no here, is not the best way to build relationships. So put those questions out there and really listen to the answers that you get. Tip 5, and this is the most important one, be humble and prepare. So anybody who does Indigenous research, even those of us who are Indigenous and do this all the time, you will screw up, you will make mistakes, but it's about how will you respond and normalizing that you know that this could happen. So what will be the process in place to protect all the parties if something goes wrong? And some of those things are like having a research agreement that helps lay out what the deliverables are, what the benefits to the community are, and what the benefits to the researcher are. And include a conflict resolution or dispute process in that research agreement. And again, seek direction from your community partner on that. You also need to be mindful that we often walk into situations like this with assumptions and bias that we're not aware of. But Indigenous ways are not always the same as non-Indigenous. So you really need to be careful, because you think you're coming in with an open mind, but you maybe have already narrowed the scope of the research like this without realizing it. A good example is a lot of our research is problem-based. We pick a problem that we want to solve. But from an Indigenous perspective, we often like to make decisions and focus on the strengths of things. So for example, IPHRC once had a grant that was for Indigenous youth suicide prevention, problem focus. We switched it though, and what we actually focused on was, you know, the role of arts-based therapies in the cultural grounding of Indigenous youth and the benefit of that on their health. So keep in mind that even if you're coming in with a problem, you're already kind of framing it in a way that most Indigenous people would not frame something. And then more common things are the value of the individual versus the value of community, which is somewhat inverse in Indigenous communities compared to non-Indigenous communities, where we really value the role of community and the individual is meant to serve community. So watch out for those assumptions. And this is an important one that a lot of people don't do. Consider an advisory committee for your project or grant, and make sure that they're comprised of your stakeholders, your community members, knowledge keepers, etc., so that all necessary voices are embedded right in the decision-making process, not just as participants in your research or interview subjects, but actually right in your decision-making process. And I promise you that advisory committee will head off 95% of the conflicts before they happen, because you're ensuring those voices are embedded right in the research. And finally, what are the consequences if you don't go about Indigenous engagement in this way and really respect the ethics of it? Delays, for sure. If you hand in a broken ethics application to the REB, it takes us more and more time to provide you with feedback and support you through that process. So really try to focus on getting it right. Broken relationships, in which cases many can't be repaired and communities will not work with someone who does bad research. They will go elsewhere. Rushing and making mistakes, and that often happens unintentionally, but that's where the time is so important. Falling apart when conflict arises because you don't have a process in place to deal with that, even though we know it's pretty much always inevitable, there's going to be some disagreements. Missed opportunities for change. If you have narrowed the scope of the research without meeting with Indigenous people and involving them in a meaningful way, you will miss opportunities to have true impact. You can contribute to the perpetuation of research that doesn't benefit Indigenous people, and you can inflict both visible and invisible harms. So there are serious consequences to not going about research in a good way. But I don't want to leave you on a bad note. So from a strengths-based approach, what are the benefits of doing research in this way? Well, number one, it's service to community, because Indigenous communities have real problems. And so, I have at the bottom here, you can solve real problems. You can help contribute to the solving of real problems and have a real impact in these communities. You can help build trust on behalf of all researchers who are trying to recover from the bad research done in the past. You can advance reconciliation. You can learn new things. You can gain skills and knowledge in a priority area because Indigenous engagement is becoming a priority and has its own priority funding announcements across all of the Tri-Council agencies. And you can advance and protect Indigenous knowledge, which is crucial because we're losing it all the time, especially with language loss. And you can build long-term relationships. So there are a lot of partners that we work with at IPHRC. And once we've put in all that time on the front end, it gets to the point where we can call them up when we see a last-minute grant opportunity because they trust us, they know we work well together, and maybe we have a 10-year relationship. And you see this a lot. Once you do this really well and you work with an Indigenous organization or community and you work well together, they don't want to let you go. They want to hold on to you and they're ready to snowball that research or that project into something else. So these are just some of the benefits of taking the time to do it right. And that's it. So I will leave some time for questions. Oh, and there's my email. You can also find it on the FNUNIV website if anyone has any follow-up questions.
Did anyone have questions? And if you can put them into the chat, it may be easier, but I think we're a decent sized group here, but we could probably take questions orally if you'd like. I have to confess, I thought it was very, very thorough as well, Cassandra. Really amazing. And I think some really significantly helpful tips. Oh, we've got Andrea.
Yeah, okay. Can you hear me? Hi, Cassandra, I'm Andrea. I know you said that, there's not only 5 tips, but these are the 5 tips. If you could have gone like a 6th tip, what were some other tips that you might have fit into your list?
I think the other ones are more, and that's almost where I find people learn more, case studies and stories of where we've done these things and where they've worked and where they haven't worked. I think one that takes a lot more time to unpack is the humility that this research requires. And you really do, and it's unintentional. We do this all the time. I work with so many researchers and clinicians who are like, there's $500,000 available for diabetes, and they only want to look at First Nations men, and they must be between the ages of 35 to 40. Okay, well, that's great. But is that what First Nations communities are asking for? Is that what the priority is? And so if you come in with all of that predetermined, you are missing out on real opportunities to do real meaningful research and expand the scope. And another thing, you know, that that I had a discussion about the other day with GoGo was we need to, at institutions, be providing researchers with other opportunities to gain these skills. A lot of this is getting caught. The only filter that catches this really at our universities is the REB process. But if you have already made all of these mistakes or you are already really struggling, the REB is a very blunt instrument for trying to address those concerns. There are a lot of other ways to address them. So my sixth tip might have been the other places that you could go to, you know, places like the Indigenous Peoples Health Research Center, places that, you know, more seasoned academics or faculty in your area that know how to do this. There are books that are great go-tos. Because thinking that this will all get caught through the REB process just delays your research even more and frustrates both the REB members, but also you as a researcher. And so I think the sixth tip would be find like a mentor, find someone who knows how to do this well and really utilize those resources before getting to the REB stage, because there's not much we can do except point out your deficiencies. That's kind of our job. So try to limit those deficiencies so that it's a little easier by the time it gets to us, and there's a lot of tools for that.
Right on, thanks. I see Cindy has her hand up.
Sorry, I'm a little bit slow and I missed part of the presentation. I'm actually up north and don't have the best internet here. I have a couple questions. And so one of them is about, and I don't know, which, do you want a question about collaborative analysis or about reciprocity?
Ooh, either. Pick which one's your favorite.
Oh, God. Well, I've talked about reciprocity more, so I'll talk about collaborative analysis. So we're doing a very large 5-year national study on the Indian residential school compensations through the IAP. We've, you know, done all kinds of analysis through media, discourse, interviews with support workers, lawyers, judges, etc. We decided that we wanted to elevate the voices of survivors in the analysis of the data. And in order to do that, we felt it was necessary to engage in what a lot of the literature calls, and there's not a lot of literature on this, collaborative analysis. So because, and I have done other research with Indigenous people, and I would say like in a lot of research that's community-based, you have to change your plan partway through, right? And so all of a sudden we had to go to ethics and say, we want to do this. It wasn't part of the original ethics, right? How do we go back to people who, you know, it's really hard to find a lot of people because their phone numbers are changing or whatever the case might be. You know, how do we go back to these people? Anyway, so ethics worked with us through this process. But I guess one of the things I'd like to say there is, you know, for somebody doing ethics, you know, reminding people that there might be a change in process. And if somehow we could have included this in our original letter of intent, it would have been more, it would have been easier to do. But anyway, one of the things we're finding is that a lot of the people we're working with aren't willing to what they would call judge or comment on other people's interviews. It's a very interesting dynamic. Or there's trauma involved. So, you know, not wanting to go there, which is, you know, that totally makes sense. But I'm just wondering if you've had experience with collaborative analysis, if you can comment on it, any sort of challenges you've had with it, publications related to it, because it's, for us, it's all fairly new and there's not a lot written on it.
You know, there's a very core tension there that really doesn't fit with sort of an Indigenous like worldview or like ontology. And so a lot of what you would find would actually not be under collaborative analysis. It's a lot more like narrative analysis. And that's because for Indigenous people, when you're telling stories, and actually you'll hear knowledge keepers say this a lot, a knowledge keeper will tell you a very powerful personal story. And they'll tell you, take what you want and leave the rest. You know, take what works from my story for you and what makes sense and leave the rest. And you won't often hear in Indigenous communities, people sort of comparing or contrasting those stories, because the power of story is in the sharing of the story. And it's not really about, and that's why there's a hesitation for me to offer analysis on someone else's story, because the story stands as it is and is meant to be sort of the way that it is. And who am I to sort of interpret that through my lens? So I think some of it is switching the lens to, we don't even like often call them data, we often call them stories, and how you would frame it differently in that way. The other question that so that's a tough one to get around. The only other thing I can think of where I've seen some projects do this, and it's really worthwhile, is so it takes so much out of survivors to tell the story, right? They tell it once and then that's it. And they may not want to come back to it. And that's totally okay in a trauma-informed approach. Sometimes what is really valuable is having intergenerational survivors provide some analysis or feedback or see what the impact is on them when they go through the stories. So my grandmother may only want to tell her story once and she may not want to look at it again or hear from other survivors because that she lived it. But you might be able to get someone else from around her, or even a group of intergenerational survivors who didn't live it, but survived the survivor, to analyze that data. So you might have to get a little creative with who it is that looks at it. And then you just need to be clear that that's who's looking at it. The other question, that I kind of have for you is, did you have a steering committee of folks, or was it just the research team? Did you have, survivors steering the research and formulating the questions from the beginning, or who was sort of driving it?
We have a knowledge keeper and then the research team, right? So, and then the NCTR is a collaborator in the research. It's a pretty big project.
Right. We're working with the NCTR on another one.
Yeah, and we have framed them all as stories, but it's like, this is a little like we don't want to bring in new people to analyze the data, right? So that's where it's kind of, but
and that's where you're hitting up a little bit against Indigenous ontology, because we just don't do that. And to put it in perspective, just gonna see, do I have, yeah. So like all the, really hardcore books on Indigenous methodology, which mostly came out of Indigenous researchers doing their PhD, there's so much hesitation from an Indigenous perspective to analyze other stories that in all of these books, this is Sean Wilson's, but I have like Maggie Kovach's, they include verbatim the sections from the people they interviewed for their research. So it's pages and pages of them transcribing, because that is how much a struggle it is for Indigenous researchers and an Indigenous mindset for us to offer analysis on someone else's story. And then I think when you add in the second layer of the group you're talking about, trying to do a trauma-informed approach, if the community's saying, no, we don't want to do that, then you kind of have to be respectful of it. And I think that's where you are trying to balance both the trauma-informed approach, the hesitation from an Indigenous ontology to offer any analysis of someone else's story, because it just really doesn't fit. But you really do have backup in how that is what Indigenous researchers do too. That's why whole sections of books are verbatim transcripts of conversations.
Yeah, I think we actually have agreed that we're going to have to do that. So, but I think this is actually offers some really interesting
Yes. And it may feel like a failure because you're like, where's the data analysis? And we
It
want to
doesn't feel like a failure because
Good.
it feels like nobody else is doing it.
Good, exactly. And so it's not a failure. It's letting go of this is how it would typically happen and what we thought we were going to do. This is what the community's telling us. And I'm telling you, if that's what Maggie Kovac is doing, that's what Sean Wilson is doing, it's okay for you to do that. And that it really comes from a deeper level of an Indigenous, ontology and epistemology about the world, that we just don't do that. It is the sharing of the story that has the most power, and not really the comparing, contrasting part of it. So I think it's just changing the mindset a little bit. And you're in a powerful place that's what they've told you that they want. Yeah.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry to interject. We do have another presenter today, so I did want to say, please continue the conversation because that's exactly what these sessions are supposed to be about. Thank you so much, Cassandra. Incredibly helpful. Really appreciate it. And I'm going to actually just send, because if people think of questions later, please, email me or Cassandra directly. And I'm going to hand the presentation over to Kim Dorsch, who is our other co-chair on the REB.
Okay, hi everyone. Just give me a second here. I have to see what I'm doing. Okay, so hopefully you can see my slides. I lost everybody, that I can't see anybody on my screen.
Yeah,
so.
we can.
Okay, great, thanks. Okay, so I just want to, I'm going to take a slightly different slant than Cassandra did. We'll talk about mainly some of the context behind how we approach doing an REB, and some of the most common comments that I seem to come across. So just a little bit about, I guess, me. I'm a professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Health Studies. My main area is sport, exercise, and health psychology. I guess my main background is with quantitative research, but in the last few years, I've had graduate and undergraduate students taking me to more research questions that are best answered through a qualitative approach. So I do feel I have an understanding of both paradigms. I started as chair in January 2021, just when we started going through the review process. So it was a very steep learning curve, I guess, and I'm still learning. First of all, I want to say our door is always open. We're always open for a chat before submitting or after a response has been provided. Sometimes I'll give you a quick call before I rate the NER if something minor needs to be just clarified. A quick chat can sometimes clarify a lot. So some general principles of how I approach the REB review. I honestly believe that it's our obligation as researchers to follow the guidelines of the TCPS2, and it's the role of the REB to ensure we meet those obligations. As Gogo said in her presentation last week, we really do need to ensure the guidelines are being followed. Otherwise, we lose our ability to apply for Tri-Council funding. So thinking of more of as, what can I do to protect participants versus the REB as a hoop just to jump through. I'm sure most of you, when you get, excuse me, an NER back, you probably said, because I have in the past, well, what a stupid question. Why are you asking me that? For example, if we're just suggesting that you cut and paste from the Qualtrics guidelines or the Zoom guidelines, our philosophy is that we need a paper trail in the file, just so that we're sure that you understand some of those questions. Also want you to really recognize that REB is, it's a dynamic process. So we're learning something new every day. There's new interpretations coming from the Tri-Council. So things that may have been approved previously, we may have some more questions about that. And following that, like each application is a new application. Going along with needing a paper trail, the reviewers and even the chairs don't have access to all previous applications. So we would appreciate if you do approach each application as a new application, include all the relevant material and procedures. You can provide us with a file number for the previous approval, but please just don't rely on that. Again, that goes to the first point regarding a paper trail. Methods versus ethics. We had this comment quite a bit in the review. We do try to stay away from comments that are more methodological. However, most of the time, we can't really separate methods from ethics. Sometimes for you getting the comments back, it may not be apparent why the question was asked. And providing an explanation could take a lengthy part of your NER. So sometimes we wait for your comment back to better explain it. Sometimes a reviewer will have an area of expertise that is directly related to the application. And if they have some kind of comment to make, I will probably include that, but I'll usually have a preface statement that this is more methods than ethics. Recommendations versus must do. So the comments in the NER are based on the TCPS2 guidelines. However, there are shades of gray. Some are negotiable, some aren't. So if you can provide an acceptable rationale or justification for why you do not want to adopt the comment, we will consider your response. TCPS2 core training, there is a new TCPS2 out there dated 2022. So it would be beneficial for researchers to update their core training. Just remember that there is a university policy that requires all members, including faculty, research assistants, and students to complete this training. So we do encourage you to update your core training. And kind of the last general principle, it really does take a village on some of the more complex applications. And even on some of the ones that aren't, I will talk with Gogo and now Cassandra to discuss the application. And in quite a few cases, we have provided a joint NER where 3 or more of us have had input into it. Okay, so some of the common comments that I see or I give a lot. I also want to say that Converse application was designed to take care of some of these most common comments. So we're hoping the new Converse system will speed up the review process. But one of the big things is details and consistency. When I receive a response to the NER, I usually check to make sure that what you say in the response is what you have put in to the attached appendices. A lot of the times it isn't. So just, paying attention to those small little details will really help speed up your application process. Making sure to attach all the appendices that you've changed and highlighting on those attachments all the changes that have been made. So for example, on a consent form, if you highlight the changes, all I really have to do is go back to ensure that you've made those changes instead of reading the whole consent form again. And sometimes they can be a little lengthy. Inconsistency throughout the application. Sometimes researchers will say something in one section, but then contradict that point in another. So hopefully, again, Converse will help us with this. Just want to talk a little bit about the supervisor's role. As a supervisor, you're integral in speeding up the process. We do realize that doing an REB application is a learning process and part of the student's learning process. And we will do our part in teaching students. But a lot of the comments that I do put on the NER attempt to explain why we are asking the question, and we do try to refer back to the specific Tri-Council policy article. As a supervisor myself, I do believe supervisors discuss the application and the NER with their students. Sometimes I'm a little suspicious that they actually look at the application because of those details and consistency problems that I pointed out earlier. Right now, we are trying to give student applications priority in the review process, and having to go back and forth with numerous NERs does slow down that process. One thing specifically about the application itself is to the storage of and access to the data. So it's my understanding that technically the data should not leave the University of Regina once the student has graduated. So it should be in the supervisor, the supervisor is responsible for storing the data securely. And this policy is just to ensure the data are available in case there is a complaint lodged after with the compliance office. We are working on some issues that have arisen in the recent past, but those just need clarification. Multi-part or partnership studies. Make sure to describe each part. So if you have a quantitative part and a qualitative part, make sure to describe each of those parts. Again, I believe Converse is really going to help us with this one. The one thing though, if a phase 2 part of your study is based on the completion and the outcomes of phase 1, it might be worth your while to talk with GoGo before putting in an entire phase 1, phase 2 application, because it might be better to wait until you have phase 1 completed before you're starting phase 2. So like the trouble here is that we can't approve something that we don't know what it will be. So even if you're using qualitative interviews to create a questionnaire, for example, we would need to see the questionnaire before we could let you go ahead with phase 2. So again, potentially an amendment could be submitted, but again, talking with GoGo first before even beginning the application would be in your best interests. Recruitment. The REB requires that all planned outgoing communications like emails or phone scripts are submitted to be reviewed. And this is mainly because recruitment is the first part of the consent process. So we do really need to see what you're saying and how you're recruiting. So really think your way through this process. Are you recruiting through outside organizations? Are you recruiting through social media sites? What is the communication to the potential partner or participants that you will ask those organizations to send? And then when they contact you, what are you going to say to them, indicating how the next steps going forward? So really think yourself through all of those steps. Technology, the U of R currently supports Qualtrics and Zoom for a few different reasons, basically because we have a license, and the U of R, when U of R accounts are used, support from the U of R IT is available. And really kind of key here is that the security configuration has passed through the IT department. So if you're choosing not to use U of R supported software, we do need explicit details regarding the software security. You can provide us a link, but we also need the details explained by you in the application itself. Transcripts and member checking. This is kind of a big one that I've been putting on a lot of NERs that are using qualitative research. Really, who is transcribing, making sure this is stated on the consent form. Are you sending transcripts or even summaries back to participants? If participants could be identified based on a direct quote, we do suggest that you at least think about getting a transcript or a summary release form. Along with this is how identifying how you're going to record consent, particularly if you're doing interviews over Zoom. So are you going to record consent on the transcript using the consent form template, which would then be a hard copy, or a consent log? So we need to know that. And if you're going to use a consent log, we would need to have that included in the application. Emails, if you're using email as a communication tool, no email is secure, not even U of R. So participants need to be told their inherent security issues. We have a typical statement that we usually add in that you guys can use or amend to fit your study. Compensation is a big one. If you expect to be reimbursed for the compensation from a FOPL account, there are certain procedures, and we do have guidelines, procedures for cash and cash equivalents that would be beneficial for you to look at. One big key thing to note, if you are providing compensation like gift cards, honorarium, etc., that as soon as a person consents to be involved in their study, that you are responsible for providing them that consent. And the issue then becomes, if you're doing an anonymous survey, how are you going to get their contact information? We usually suggest sending them to I call it a file termination survey, but a survey that's separate from the actual survey where you're collecting data. And take a look at the guidelines and templates. ERA worked very, very hard on developing guidance notes for Converis for researchers. And we have some guidelines. You can see the link provided there. We have like guidelines on consent forms, assent forms, procedures for compensation, Zoom, although we updated our Zoom one. So I usually send that along. We have snowball sampling, participant parking at U of R, recruitment poster, confidentiality agreements. We also have templates that will be on the website very soon, but I usually send the relevant ones along with the NER. So we have things like adverse events form, consent forms for anonymous surveys, email communications for sending and receiving transcripts or summary, transcript or summary release forms, updated Zoom guidelines, incident reporting form, master list template, photo voice self-theming guidelines. We have recruiting communications, what is needed, and we have an example of a verbal consent log as well that we borrowed from another university. And I think finally, just a reminder that we're always here to answer questions or help come to an agreement. We are more than willing to meet with researchers that have some questions regarding their application or the questions on the NER. And that's it for me. And I will stop sharing and check out if there's any.
Thank you so much, Kim. I do not see any questions on the chat, but is there any questions? No? Okay, if anyone thinks of anything after the fact, or you have any questions or concerns, I have put my email in the chat, and I can put Kim's in there right now as well, if that's okay, Kim. And Cassandra's is also on there. So please feel free to reach out to us at any time. And thank you so much, Cassandra and Kim, super helpful. And I think especially
there's a hand up.
There is a hand up. Sorry about that.
Sorry, I just did. Yeah, I was just wondering if you guys have seen a lot of ethics applications for like class-based research, and what that process might look like and how it might differ from other kinds of REB applications?
Yeah, sorry, I guess you were looking at my dogs the whole presentation. Yeah, we do, and they're hard. They're tough, they're really tough, and we really need to, those are some of the ones that we really would like to talk through even before you start putting in your application, because there's a lot of ethical issues about going into the classroom and observing, and depending on the age of the student that you're trying to observe, then getting parental consent, there's just, it's complex, very complex. Yeah.
Yeah, I was more thinking like having undergraduates like doing research as part of their class work. And so some of that I think would yeah, like course-based, Andrea Sturzik is saying, yeah, like course-based research and how to integrate that into the course. You know, it's part of what they're being assessed on as their coursework, and part of that, you know, potentially engaging with Indigenous communities as well.
Yeah, we do have a course-based application on Converse, so that may help you answer some of your questions as you go through that. And those course-based applications don't go to the full REB. GoGo just looks at those ones, so they're not don't take as long as the others.
Okay, thank you.
Olivia, please reach out if you have any questions about how to go about doing that application prior to going on to Converse. I'd be glad to with you.
Okay, thank you. Go.
That's right. This is what a go-go is. You can't see me, but I am here. And I am actually the research compliance specialist that deals with human research.
Thank you for clarifying that, Gogo, because I've been co-chair of the REB for like 2 months now, and I'm like, why do we call her Gogo? Should I be saying Gogo? Or so thank you for clarifying.
You're welcome. Did I see any other hands or no? Okay, I think we are right at the proper time there. And again, thank you so much both to Kim and Cassandra. I certainly learned a lot, and I thought it was really helpful. And if anybody does have questions or comments that you think of afterwards, you know, please do let us know, and we will get replies to you. And please know that we're always here, we're accessible, and would be glad to, you know, answer questions even prior to you starting with application processes. Thanks again for joining today. Thank you to our speakers.